Okay, apparently we actually are going on YouTube as well, so hopefully we can open up the phone lines later on, and if people want to phone in and ask you questions, Michael,
okay.
Be good.
What should I call this again? This is the
reason diversion. Well, yeah.
Reason. I had this tweeted before. Let me look. Oh, sorry.
Reggie, I can't hear the intro if you're playing it.
Hello, welcome once again to the Legion of Reason Diversion. This is episode 235. I am your host, the Supreme Irreverend Dr. Randy Tyson, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Christine. Was that sexist? I guess it was.
Yes, but thank you. I'll take it.
That was
benevolent sexism.
And today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Michael Rectenwald, who is the author of a new book that is coming out on August 1st. You can get it on Amazon, pre-order it now. It's called Springtime for Snowflakes, a very provocative title. And Michael is a professor of liberal studies at New York University, and there he teaches writing and cultural history. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, this is going
to.
Yeah, thank you. This is going to be, well, this is kind of right down my, in my bailiwick, because I've been monitoring what's been going on in universities, particularly in Canada, but it's hard not to notice some of the stuff that goes on in the United States. And you've had your own run-ins with the social justice crowd, the ideological version of it, for sure.
Yeah.
And dogmatically ideological. And we're going to discuss I think we'll start with your own personal experiences at university when you posted that article on a student who I thought this was a supremely wonderful way of protesting, gender pronouns. Select your own gender pronouns, and he chose His Majesty, which I think is beautiful. And then it started from there. So what happened after you posted that story?
Yeah, I mean, this was in the fall of 2016. It was like late December, roughly. I'm sorry, September. And the student posted the student issued his pronoun choice of His Majesty at the University of Michigan, and then it became news because it was such a blasphemous thing to do in violating the social justice creed. And then all hell broke loose on my Facebook account. I had a lot of leftist friends, probably 3,000 of them at that point. And many of them were trans. Not many, but a significant number. Anyway, I posted this link without comment. And then I merely went to teach class. I had 2 classes back to back, and after I got out of those classes, I saw that the feed had gone insane. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of posts and arguments and denunciations and many instant messages or whatever to me directly, calling me a transphobe and accusing me of having committed discursive violence and having betrayed the trans community, all for posting this link on a humorous story. So that's when I decided that this was, like, I call it my social justice tipping point. And at that point, I decided to create the anti-PC NYU prof Twitter account. At that time, I called him the deplorable NYU prof, and I should probably explain that. What I wanted to do was to voice sort of solidarity with those flyover states people that Hillary Clinton had consigned to the basket of deplorables. This was not indicative of Trump support, but rather a sort of statement about the elitism of Clinton and the whole cultural liberal left elite, paying for the majority is palpable. So I used that handle and started to tweet peaks of social justice and PC authoritarianism. And soon after that, I was noticed by a reporter for the Washington Square News, which is the NYU student newspaper. He interviewed me, and I said, sure. I'm going to go on the record, but after I gave the interview, I thought, man, this is what I'm saying is important, and I feel perfectly fine saying it. And yet, after the interview appeared, then the whole certain elements of administration and faculty and mobilized to condemn me and actually push me into a leave of absence. So they keep lying about it. They called the meeting with the dean and the head of human resources. I didn't call any meeting, and in the meeting, they started to squeeze me into this idea that I needed help. And, a lot of reasons why I acceded to their imploring me to take a leave of absence because I had things on the line. One of them being a promotion that I had applied for 6 months previous, and things like that. So it all broke loose from there. Strangely enough, after I got out of that meeting with the dean, in which they decided to go on a leave, I agreed. It was voluntary, quote unquote, but under enormous stress and coercion. and then went on that leave, and then the New York Post called me that minute and somehow knew more about the story than I did, that there had been this open letter written against me in the same paper, Washington Square News. I didn't know about that before the meeting with the dean, and they condemned me roundly, all kinds of, they declared me guilty for the structure of my thinking, in other words, for my ideological framework. So I was guilty for that. Not wrong, but guilty, which is a whole different level of condemnation. That is a moral, they condemned me morally. They made it a moral issue, and that some sort of criminal, crimes they made it real.
I kind of liken this kind of thing to L'Étranger, Camus' book, seminal book, where, you know what you did, now prove your innocence.
Yes. And it's a number of people have brought that novel up in relation to this situation lately. I didn't shoot anybody on a beach, but I did fire off some, they were satirical tweets. Some of them were, there was a little bit of hyperbole there, but not really. I was trying to get at, in fact, by the end of the year, that year, 2016, what I said wasn't hyperbolic at all, because by the end of that academic year, Berkeley's campus had been burned down, over a speaker that they didn't like, and all kinds of things actually took place. Brett Weinstein was run out of school. Basically, a social justice militia took over the entire Evergreen College campus. Yep. So this stuff just escalated. I was just predictive, really, of what was going to happen, and they said I didn't have any evidence for what I was saying. That's only because they didn't know what was going on, apparently. They didn't read the news or follow what's happening, or maybe they don't care, or they thought it was, baseless. But just because they don't have the knowledge of the evidence doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But anyway, then, it just became a big story, cause celeb, and, NYU tried to set me up with they tried to set me up and saying, do you still want this leave of absence? And this was 2 weeks after the semester had already been, 2 weeks later had passed, 2 weeks had passed. They had handed off my classes to other people who did not follow my syllabus as promised, and I couldn't go back. There was no way to go back. I'd actually subletted my apartment in New York. Once you do that, you have nowhere to live. So, it was like, yeah, I'm going to stay on the leave, but a leave that they suggested. And so I got back after that year. After that semester, I came back in the spring. By the end of the spring semester, I faced a barrage of email attacks from a small group of faculty members on a major listserv going out to over 100 people, and they called me everything from racist, sexist, short pants white boy to fragile white male, and all kinds of things. While they said I was a racist and sexist, they hurled racist and sexist epithets at me, which I had never done. I never mentioned a single person by name. I never mentioned any racial groups, anything. And individuals, in any of my critiques, they were institutionally directed. So that's where it is, and so I filed a lawsuit against those colleagues and NYU for failure to mitigate and stop that abuse that went on for 4 days until I complained.
So that lawsuit is ongoing, of course, and
yes,
yeah,
they filed a motion to dismiss. They have a legal militia. They have a veritable army of lawyers opposing us, and so it's not easy. But we'll see what happens.
What's the at New York University, what is the student body like? Is it progressive, or is it?
Oh yeah, it's the liberal ethos is doctrine, and it is dogma, really. And the students, I understand. They're not that doctrinaire in the classroom per se, but I understand in the dorms, it's a social justice police state. And I mean, I understand that most of my students disagreed with some of the things I said. For example, I said, you don't have a right not to be offended by what someone says.
Yeah, I say that all the time.
Yeah, I said that in class. I said, I don't know where people get this idea that there's a right not to be offended. I said, there's no such right anywhere, at least in the United States. We don't have that right. And they were shocked. They just don't understand that they have been put on, they've been pretty much indoctrinated into these ideas that the protection of people, their fragile identities and psyches is paramount, and that's the most important thing, and everything should be centered on that. And microaggression reporting against offenders should be no problem. I don't see any problem with that. I mean, the students and I get along great because I don't fight with them. I open up classroom to an enormous panoply of views and perspectives, and I don't indoctrinate.
You don't tell people what to think. You're teaching them how to think, right?
Yeah, I teach them how to think through reading and studying examples of arguments, and also different perspectives on arguments and different critical standpoints, and actually from various disciplinary standpoints as well.
Yeah. So, how did we get here? How did this come about? I mean, social justice used to be about real issues. Mm-hmm. And for reasonable people, it still is. But how did we get here? I mean, it seemed to happen very quickly, and it's with a particular, the modern generation, the one that's just getting into university. I know Jonathan Haidt says that I actually came to the same conclusion, that a lot of this has to do with parenting and overly protecting children from failure, from dealing with ideas that they don't agree with.
Yeah, this is part of this is part of it, but this explanation fails to account for the ideological predispositions of the professoriate that encourage this, and also the entire ethos of the university, which has been shaped by postmodern theory for the last 40 to 50 years. And many of the ideas that are being bandied about through social justice really come out of postmodern and other leftist academic theories and ideas and really dogma. And I trace that in the book. I show just how different ideas in the social justice worldview stem from these postmodern theoretical origins, and some also in critical theory, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory as well, and also from early, even from Marxism. But there's been a great transmutation of leftist theory or leftist thinking from Marxism to social justice, and I say that in the book that postmodern theory is the missing link between these two, the older leftism of Marxism and the new leftism of social justice ideology. The interspecies there is postmodern theory, and the transmutations really took place in postmodern theory. The radical relativism, the subjectivism, and the philosophical idealism, and the social and linguistic constructivism, and on and on and on. I talk about all this in the book.
Yeah, let's start there. What is postmodernism in a nutshell?
Yeah, in a nutshell, let's say I don't want to limit it to postmodern theory. Postmodernism also incorporates other things besides postmodern theory, including the postmodern arts movement in arts and architecture and culture more broadly. So I don't really, you can't condemn postmodern culture. Really, it's like condemning air or something. It happens to be just the culture that we exist in. But theory is a different matter. So I limit this to postmodern theory, And postmodern theory is, and I could talk about postmodernism more broadly, but I think right now just postmodern theory. It's an assemblage of theoretical positions that grew out of a response to the failure of the student movement in 1968 in France, to the failure to overthrow the system. In conjunction with the public workers, the students rose up. They thought they were on the precipice of overthrowing capitalism. It did not happen. Postmodern theory was a pessimistic response to the failures of the left through classical and other Marxist ideas to overtake the social order as prescribed. And instead of that, what we had was failure and then a pessimistic response, which is postmodern theory, which claimed that in general, that master narratives like Marxism, Christianity, you name it, any overarching explanatory theoretical understanding of the world that pretends to explain everything potentially are themselves oppressive and should be eschewed, and in fact aren't at all. They don't at all account for reality. So postmodern theory was inaugurated as an idea by Francois Lyotard in a book called A Report on Knowledge: The Postmodern Condition, in 1979, and that book argued about the presence of these master narratives, and postmodernism is a response against these master narratives, these master explanatory uber narratives that would explain all of social reality. And instead, postmodern theorists tried to do more local and limited subversive things, like attacking the foundations of language, as in deconstruction and post-structuralism, subverting capitalism in very limited ways, as in Michel de Certeau's notions in The Practice of Everyday Life, or protesting and attempting to change institutions, particularly as in the case of Michel Foucault and the prison system and the insane asylum. So there were more limited political objectives, and this is where the idea of the political is local comes from. And so postmodernism, or postmodern theory, limits its actions to local actions, doesn't look for overthrowing the system, sees Marxism, in fact, as a master narrative in itself, something to be eschewed and potentially totalitarian. And in fact, it was, but not for the reasons they say.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned the Frankfurt School. They were rather Marxist in their thinking as well.
Well, they were.
And who
Frankfurt
were they,
School of
actually?
Critical Theory, which came out of Frankfurt, and they were a group of Jewish intellectuals who formed a critical theory school, and they immigrated to the U.S. in 1933 to escape Nazism. And the major figures that came over were Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, and they settled it first at Columbia and then at Berkeley and then elsewhere. They inaugurated two schools of thought, or two disciplines really. Critical theory and also media studies comes from them. They were, in the case of Adorno and Horkheimer, they were a strange admixture of high modernist elitism and Marxism, a kind of T.S. Eliot with Marxist sensibilities instead of fascist ones. And they critiqued mass culture, particularly, and they critiqued the Enlightenment. In this book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, they critiqued the Enlightenment, and this was the beginning of the postmodern turn, if you will, when they critiqued Enlightenment rationality as not the liberational or liberatory, as they put it, element as in classical Marxism rationality, or as in leftism from the French Revolution and before on. Rationality was seen as a tool to to undo oppression. Instead, they saw rationality, enlightenment rationality, at least one kind of it, which they called instrumental rationality, as part of the problem, actually a cage, as in Weber's notion of the iron cage of rationality, which he saw as the commonality between the oppressive systems of the USSR and the United States. Rationality, bureaucratic rationality, rather than actually class, became the real formative element in oppression, so forth.
Wow.
So they integrated this critique of enlightenment rationality, which the postmodern theorists really picked up on and ran with. And one of the main sort of axes to grinding axis that they grind in postmodern theory is the enlightenment rationality, which they see as having been mistakenly elevated and actually being a source of domination over nature and over people.
So they weren't very fond of science.
They instituted a critique of science, and it came under the rubric of this field called science studies. And science studies included sociologists, feminists, Marxists, all sorts of, Pan-Africanists, all these different critiques of science from different perspectives, including postmodern theory. And this critique of science involved the idea that science was merely language for the most part, just like everything else, that it was no different than other human activities, in particular literature, for example. It's like literature in the sense that it uses language, and there's no real, from the postmodernist standpoint, what they said was that language really had no real connection to the object world that it describes. So basically, it stands alone, and this is what Derrida said. He said there was nothing outside of text, which is to say that text that reputedly pointed to ontological entities outside of itself now were seen as strictly pointing to themselves, and that any ontologies that existed actually existed only in language. So this involves this kind of involution of language as a sort of self-referential system that doesn't point to anything. So science becomes problematized because it is a system that depends on symbolics, on language and other science systems, right? So it's not that they thought that they thought there could be a liberational science or liberatory science that didn't rely on such masculinist, phalo-logocentric, notions of that science was dominated by.
Now they're talking about decolonizing science and stuff like that. Is that along the same observations?
Yeah, science just follows from all this.
Yeah.
Still going on. So what is social justice is kind of like a cartoon version of postmodernism. It's like they took very highfalutin and quite complex ideas, and they broke them down into like sort of sound bites and idiot constructions. It's like that's a good put. Social justice is postmodernism for theory for idiots. There should be a book out like that.
Well, there probably is actually.
Yeah.
Do you find the insights valuable from the postmodern perspective? Because my take is that one shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. But it certainly has its criticisms that,
Yeah, I mean, it's like everything else that makes assertions. There are elements of truth in it. The problem is that there's, for example, like this guy Bruno Latour, who was he's a science studies theorist. He probably
we talked about him.
Oh, you have talked about him?
No, you and I have talked about him.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I know. Studying it too.
For the first book. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. You were saying?
No, you're saying.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just saying that we were talking about Bruno Latour behind the scenes, and yeah.
Yeah.
His
book with Steve Woolgar was called "Laboratory Life: The Construction of Scientific Facts," And in that book, he suggested with Woolgar that science was really a matter of literary inscription. That's really what the product was. The product was writing. And that facts existed nowhere outside of the text. So very much along the same lines as Derrida, except applied strictly to science itself. So they pulled a bit of, there's something to that, of course. It's true.
Yeah, the rhetorical element, like Latour talks about how a scientific paper is a rhetorical tool of persuasion, which,
yeah,
sorry.
I think
yeah. And you want your colleagues to take up your theory and enact it. And,
there were some very good elements to the actor network theory, which he inaugurated in the next book. And makes a very bizarre move in it. I could talk about that, but let me get this piece on the table about the construction of facts. So there's truth to the idea that science consists of language, and that fact, like the knowledge in science is textual. Knowledge is textual. Yeah, it's symbolic and textual. Mm-hmm. But what they did is, through a piece of legerdemain, is that they can manage to conflate the knowledge about reality with the reality itself, so that the object of science becomes involuted and enfolded within language itself and disappears into the text. So, yeah, they had a point that science depends upon language and linguistic and symbolic construction in order to make to make claims about truth, about facts, and so on and so forth. But the problem is that they played a very sort of strong-handed version of that, in which they suggested that facts exist nowhere outside of the text at all. So that the object world is really nowhere else but in the text, just like in deconstruction for Derrida. Similarly, you're right, they talk about how science is a series of rhetorical statements that are modalized and depend upon the assent and support of various actors along a network who contribute their various pieces of support in terms of financial or rhetorical or even other facts, participate, and previous knowledge claims. They enroll into this network, and then creates this using like a black box analogy. It creates object of scientific knowledge that is obdurate and too difficult to unpack or overthrow, and that's when something becomes a fact or an accepted theory.
Black boxed.
It's an interesting social network paradigm for understanding science. What he did next was said, strangely, that after you do construct these facts, you can no longer really aim to unpack them as a sociologist. So he kind of he did it in two cases in this book.
Science in Action.
Science in Action.
Yeah.
Demonstrated it in one technology and one science case, and then said it can't be done. So it was ridiculous. But the main point, though, for most of the people who are listening, has to do with the idea that that in terms of the postmodern element of science studies, it really became a particularly epistemological nihilism, and that is, they suggested basically there's really no knowledge that's at all being understood. I mean, anything could pass as scientific knowledge. It's just a matter of since nothing has any real correspondence any more than anything else to the object world, any theory is as good as any other. And this is absurd. And this was taken up by the physicist Alan Sokal when he sent a paper to Social Text edited by Andrew Ross and a bunch of other people. Andrew Ross at NYU, Alan Sokal at NYU, and both still there, and both two colleagues and friends. And actually, Andrew Ross is a friend of mine, but he fell for the Sokal hoax, in which Sokal wrote a paper called Transgressing the Boundaries on I forget the subtitle, but the idea was that it was he argued in the paper that gravity, quantum gravity, was a social and linguistic construct.
It was totally impenetrable.
Like geology nowadays, right?
I read the paper.
They took it seriously and they published it. It was a hoax.
Yeah.
He was totally hoaxing and scamming the entire field of science studies, showing what a ridiculous enterprise it was, at least in this postmodern incarnations. And they published it. And just the interesting thing is that only a few months before Ross accepted that paper from Sokol, he had suggested that it was ridiculous to argue that the science studies scholars would ever problematize something like gravity. That they would ever deny something like gravity exists. And what do you know? Sokol writes a paper, says that gravity is a construct that even the material world is problematized as existing. And so, they saw this in print. It's hilarious when you read it. It's hilarious. So the very nature of existence has been problematized by quantum mechanics, and they bought it. It got published, and he revealed the hoax in lingua franca later, and he totally made a joke, a laughing stock of the field, and all the postmodern theorists came to the rescue, like even Stanley Fish in the New York Times. He lambasted him for being unethical, as if postmodern science studies wasn't unethical in the first place.
It's totally ethical to point out absurdities in a field.
That's right.
Peter Boghossian, are you familiar with Peter Boghossian? I'm sorry, I can't remember. Yeah. And he did a similar thing. It had something to do with the penis.
Conceptual penis.
That's right.
Yeah, conceptual penis.
Yeah. It was called the conceptual penis. It was modeled after the Sokol hoax. It was a kind of mini Sokol hoax. On I guess it was on.
I can't remember where it was.
I don't know. I'm trying.
It was some peer-reviewed journal, I think. Right.
Yeah, but what is he parroting there? I forget. I did read it.
I guess the idea of the patriarchy.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. Because there was a study out about I don't know if you heard about this, but it was I think it was California or some state funded a study on glaciers, and they suggested that glaciers have never been studied from a feminist standpoint.
Sorry, what did you say?
Glaciology.
Glaciers, yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Somebody didn't believe me that was a real thing, and I sent them the abstract, and you weren't kidding. I'm like, no, I wasn't kidding. It's out there.
Well, there's that real peer review on Twitter, right?
Yeah, that's where I saw it. Yeah.
This is a social justice version of science studies, and you see that it gets like I said, it's like a cartoon version of postmodern theoretical ideas. The conceptual penis was printed in the Skeptic later, I guess, and it's called the conceptual penis as a social construct, a Sokol-style hoax on gender studies. That's the follow-up article where they reveal what they did. And I don't know, the paper was about, what did it address? The penis vis-a-vis maleness is an incoherent construct. We argue that the conceptual penis is better understood not as an anatomical organ, but as a gender-performative, highly fluid social construct. But what are they saying this with reference to? I still don't know, but we can look it up.
Well, it's supposed to be totally impenetrable language, so you can't get published in those fields without
constructed,
that. Yeah.
But there's a form of language where you do get, these things do get accepted as peer-reviewed papers, right?
Oh yeah, and there's a Twitter account that publishes
new peer review
these papers and shows how ridiculous these peer-reviewed papers are that get published. And
real peer review.
Yeah, new real peer review.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, it shows you what the social sciences and parts of the humanities have come to in many cases, and it's pathetic.
Yeah.
It's just parading around a bunch of prefabricated lexical units and plugging them together like Legos in a series of
Exactly. I keep saying that it's, it may be syntactically correct, but it has absolutely no meaning. It's just literally word salad. I mean, yeah, sure, it passes an English exam, but it doesn't say anything.
And it's plug and play language. It's like Orwell said about political language, that it isn't really. What they do is they take these charged linguistic units and plug them together, and together they vibrate and create some sort of effect. But that's the argument. That's all they do to make this argument, is to plug. First, they charge these memes with extra meaning and intensity, like, oh my God, if it's phallocentric, if it's this, if it's that, that's bad. So throw that stuff together: phallocentric, colonialist, masculinist, androcentric, blah blah blah. You piece all these things together, and then they come out with this effect. It's like it vibrates at a higher frequency.
Yeah, Deepak Chopra does exactly the same thing, except he makes more money.
Who's that?
Deepak Chopra.
Deepak Chopra. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
He does exactly the same thing.
It's fine to be an artist and write poetry if you like, but don't pass it off as like
an empirical
social science or psychology. If you're going to write poetry, do it. Go for
it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it boggles the mind, some of the stuff that comes out on New Real Peer Review, because I remember the oppressive whiteness of Antarctica is another one.
Yeah,
air conditioning is sexist. Nature is racist. Blah blah blah. Right?
When I was on leave, there was a 12-inch snowfall in New York, and I posted a tweet about how the snowfall was white supremacist.
Yep.
It was erasing color difference and so on and so forth. Yeah.
But you also have a secular side to you. You're involved in being very secular.
Well, I have I shouldn't say that I'm not a secular advocate type. I'm a scholar of secularism, and there's a difference. I have done work on secularism, 19th century British secularism in particular. I have a book on that. It deals with science, religion, and literature, and particularly the main character there is George Holyoake, who actually coined the word secularism and secularist, what he, I have a really particular argument about what secularism was, and it wasn't anti-religious at all. It wasn't an anti-religious movement or an atheist movement at all. In the outset, it was actually Holyoake was reacting more to the vitriolic negation of the working class or atheist movement than he was to religion. He was offering an alternative to that atheist movement and suggesting that secularism would abstain from making declarative statements about God and whether God exists or not, and instead would simply be a union of both religious and non-religious people to improve secular conditions in this world, in this life.
So it's kind of transformed from that to separation of church and state. How did that thinking?
There's two different types of two different branches of secularism. One is called worldview secularism, which is this branch that I'm talking about with Holyoake. Mm-hmm. This is the ideational or ideological, if you will, element of secularism or type of secularism. It's not about political. It's not political secularism, which is the other type. Political secularism is the type of secularism that is involved in actual state politics. Worldview secularism is for lack of a better word, it's a creed, and even that creed changed very soon after Holyoake inaugurated secularism in 1852 or 1851. And started a federalist secular union with different secular groups throughout the country, but they were in a kind of loose federation. Then Charles Bradlaugh came along very soon after he was a very bombastic, and he was more rhetorically gifted than Holyoake. And he returned secularism. He took secularism and made it into an into an atheist movement. He said you could not have secularism was atheist. There was a debate between Holyoake and him in, I think, 1870, and they argued it out about how, Holyoake said secularism was not atheist. It was not meant to be atheist. It didn't have a declare. It was a sort of a methodological materialism rather than a philosophical one. That is, it did not make declarative statements about the existence or non-existence of God. That it simply limited its scope of reference to the material. And this actually I argue in the book, is a precursor to Huxley's scientific naturalism and agnosticism.
Yeah, it was Huxley that coined the term agnostic, but it's the difference between methodological and philosophical naturalism is, operationally speaking, there's really no difference. But the philosophical naturalism does make a claim. It's interesting to look at the history of that, and actually I'm going to have to go look that book up because I'd like to see how that line of thinking changed. That rivulet of thought changed over time, and it's because humanism has a long history, and it wasn't always associated with atheism. And probably still it doesn't need to be.
It started in a religious tradition in Catholicism with Erasmus, who was a monk.
Yeah, and
trying to negotiate bad aspects of, or incorrect aspects of Scripture with, that which we would be more inclined to accept as secular people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was just a reorientation of human life to some extent. At first, sort of recalibration, suggesting that humans should be concerned with human flourishing on their own terms, rather than as relating to or judged by or in conjunction with or as against God. And so it was just about a new understanding of human flourishing. And the calibration and the sort of way of regarding that flourishing, whether that flourishing was to be understood in terms of the human scale or in the terms of the divine scale, and then it got transmuted with when Protestant Reformation came around. There was much more opportunity to divorce it from theism entirely, and they did.
Yeah. Then there was, of course, the secular humanism, which was a pejorative actually when it was first coined by it was a British C of E bishop, I think, who coined it, if not the Archbishop. And we took that and that pejorative and ran with it. It's like, thank you. That's a great term.
Happened with scientific naturalism. It was first the phrase was first used by a religious interlocutor who suggested that it was a horrible divorce of science and humanity and their enterprises from connection with God, and it was a pejorative. It was an epithet, and then Huxley apparently read it in fact in the Secularist Journal edited by Holyoake. So that's what I'm saying. Holyoake actually, I think, invented scientific naturalism, and Huxley took credit for it. Which always happens, especially when you're dealing with working class intellectuals like Holyoake, and who had much less stature and ability to defend himself and to assert himself than somebody like Huxley did.
Yeah, that was a much more common thing in the 1800s, because back then it was like a gentlemanly pursuit kind of thing. Natural history and that sort of and philosophical thought in general.
Yeah, you didn't turn to some infidel working class periodical to get your philosophy. That was but incidentally, there was a lot developed there, especially through Holyoke, I think.
In cafes, there were prime breeding grounds for new thought. It's interesting. Right. You know, it's amazing how that social interactivity created so many ideas.
And the working class infidels, as they were called, they preceded the middle class crisis of faith, as it was called, and as it's been called regarding Victorian Britain, by 30 years. They were way out ahead of all this. And they were also promoting evolutionary theory way before Darwin came on the scene.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, Darwin's grandfather was actually one of the prime movers on that.
That's right.
Yeah. Prime mover, I like that.
Erasmus Darwin.
Zoonomia has a chapter in the back which deals with what we call evolution. He didn't call it that, but yeah.
These things, like great ideas are come at a time where it's ripe for it to happen. I mean, Darwin, would he have ever come up with that? He probably wouldn't have if people hadn't already put the seed of it in his mind.
I'm sure his grandfather, for goodness sake, had a developed theory of evolution that was different than his, but it was more Lamarckian, but still he did, and so he had to have read that and certainly knew that this was something to think about. If your grandfather had written about that, such an earth-shattering idea, he buried it in the back of the book. But if you knew that your grandfather, you'd probably peer into that book and take a look and see what he was saying, right?
Yeah. They would either do
Darwin is credited with introducing the mechanism for.
He got
not so much discovering evolution, but the
broad strokes. He got it right. Yeah. He didn't know certain things, but
he didn't really. But he certainly launched the theory that was confirmed by all kinds of not just within biology, but outside that field into astronomy and geology and
science in general did that, right? Because people believed in the guy that came up with the age of the Earth.
Plate tectonics?
No. That was much later. I cannot remember his name.
Talking about the inheritance of acquired characteristics?
No. The biblical, the guy who did analyze the Bible and said, okay, the Earth is 6,000. He came up with the exact time. Actually, I'm wondering what time zone, but. I never put that down.
The genealogist
they used the genealogy. I can't remember his name.
The age of the Earth,
But the main discourse there was called higher criticism, and it was a sort of an anthropological, naturalistic study of Scripture by religious people, by ministers in the Anglican Church. So they did this kind of naturalistic study of the Bible. Was the first time that it had been undertaken, and this was one source, reputedly, of the middle class crisis of faith.
Well, any time that they started looking at the world outside of Scripture, it started to be an moment. Like the guys that they would see rocks fall. How often does a rock fall in this valley in Scotland? And the response is, about every 20 years. And then they started counting all the rocks that had fallen. It's like, there's something wrong here. I've opened up the phone lines, by the way, if you want to call us at 1-587-288-1067 if anybody wants to call and has a question for Michael. And in other words, we're just going to be hop-skipping over a bunch of topics. I wanted to bring up this article in Quiet.
Let me do one thing. It's tie the social justice movement to the secular stuff. Just one thing.
Yep.
And that is, I'm arguing that social justice is a religion. And that's the problem. And that's the way to approach it and to overtake it.
I was actually going to go back to the social justice thing because this article in Quillette, I want to pronounce it Quiet because it's French, but anyway, through the Looking Glass at Concordia University, and so many things like that. They were showing a video about this deaf mother who had a deaf child, and the mother and child were going to get cochlear implants, but when the mother found out that she wouldn't get the same benefit as the baby would because she's an adult now, then she canceled it for both. And I would say, well, that's, wouldn't you want the best for your child, kind of thing. And that's exactly what the person who wrote this article in Quillette said. And somebody said, you just feel that way because you're white, cisgendered, abled, and privileged. Mm-hmm. And
well, you're hearing privileged, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
So why wouldn't who wouldn't want to offer their child just that one extra sense that could,
well, Chris,
help you flourish?
White,
I know. I'll gladly can flourish without. What's that?
You're just white, cisgendered, and privileged. How dare you?
And hearing privileged. Yeah.
I mean, this kind of example is that sort of what's going on in universities.
That is, and I think I can explain what it's about in terms of, it's called ableism, and this idea that suggesting that people with certain abilities that are, generally accorded to the human being are better off than people that don't have those abilities. This idea is being overthrown. It's a kind of, it's a sort of, it establishes a sort of hierarchy of ability, and is therefore unjust and must be abolished and eradicated, so that there's actually an inversion of the hierarchy that goes on in social justice. That is, those who have been subordinated or are lowest on the totem pole, or whatever hierarchical structure you want to call it, it's when it's inverted, they end up on the top. So everything is upside down. So basically, since the white male has been supposedly the dominant, privileged character in history, he must be relegated to the bottom and shit on. And he's no longer allowed to speak about certain things, particularly in having to do with other big others, those who are subordinated in any way. He can't possibly know anything about their positions and their knowledge base. Therefore, he's excluded from these discussions and should shut up.
The whole
what does Faisal call it? The oppression scale, right?
It's called the oppression points.
Yeah. That's exactly what Faisal says.
Yeah.
Victimhood is the new.
It's a race that runs downhill, as I say in the book. Except that when you run downhill, you somehow end up at the top.
It's I liken it to what I always say is victimhood is the new empowerment. It is. Or status, actually, probably a better way of putting it. Victimhood is the new status. Our identity, status, same thing,
Identity politics falls.
Identity politics, it's the bane of humanity.
It is an identity politics. Identity is the way of ranking people. It's vis-a-vis their identities that the ranking system is established and set up. And, this is how we rank people, and then they're corded in. For example, in a certain what they call progressive stacking in the classroom, there is actually a pedagogical tool called progressive stacking, in which the professor calls on those most subordinated first, then the next least, the next subordinated, then the next subordinated, and so on and so forth. So if you have a black, lesbian, trans person, they're definitely going first. The white, straight male, of course, speaks last, and therefore probably never.
If at all, yeah.
And completely, this is called social justice, right?
Cosmic justice, I think, is
totally anti-egalitarian. And in the social justice world, in the social justice utopia, it's not democratic because some people will not get a say, as they're not getting a say anymore. Now, obviously, they're not going to get a say. They have no say in anything. They should shut up.
Identity politics I liken to the new astrology. It says everything about you without knowing anything about you, based on your immutable characteristics, or based on the stars. Same thing. It's just as valid as that is to say.
That's right. And as such, it's an essentialism, which is something that has been decried in the leftist academic circles for 50 years. Anything that applies to people in essence, from which they can't escape, has been the bugaboo, something to be utterly avoided, hated, and decried. And instead, they marshal essentialism all the time. Only they're allowed to. Only they're allowed to.
That's an interesting take, but it seems pretty accurate to me.
Fits all the hits all the points, that's for sure.
Just I haven't heard the word essentialism for a very long time now.
Me neither, actually.
You kind of bring it up as a theoretical criticism. That's exactly the word.
Last time I heard the word essentialism was when it was an example on wearing of. I can't remember his name. He's been at TAM a few times speaking. He's a neuroscientist, and he'd give a sweater out to people to try on, and then what if I told you if that sweater was worn by a serial killer, and no one tries it on because they believe that somehow it would transfer to them.
Right.
It's interesting. Of course,
essentialism is interestingly, it was first used as against the idea of gender as a social construct, right? That in terms of human beings, that is an identity. I mean, there's philosophical essentialism and things like that, but I'm talking about gender essentialism, where it was thought that if you ascribe to women or men traits that were, conventionally and always associated with them, and unavoidably associated with them, then that was a form of essentialism, and you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't ascribe to people traits like that. But when transgenderist theory mobilizes essentialism in this notion of the sex brain, that is, they're supposedly people who are in the wrong bodies have the brain of the opposite gender or sex. That's why that's their ultimate explanation for transgenderism, that I am a male, but I have a female brain. That is an essentialism, if I ever heard one. That is ascribing to females a certain type of brain that is strictly theirs, And that may be true that there is a female brain, but I'm just underscoring the contradiction.
Yes.
Of sex. Who are allowed to do whatever they want with all the bad ideas.
What does it mean to be a woman in the first place, right? That's an essential category if you just level it down to a stereotype or
my position is that these stereotypes or beliefs are based in biology, but the problems happen when we start thinking binary and not statistically, because there's a lot of overlap in behavior between men and women, but they do exhibit different behaviors. I mean, it would be a shock that they didn't, because just about every animal on the planet
differences, but they're not all. There's an overlap of sameness and a binary differences. What's so hard to understand about that? It's a Venn diagram, people. Come on.
Exactly. But you say that, and the social justice people come out of the woodwork
and you cannot say the word biology. You can't say evolutionary psychology. You can't invoke these fields or these notions in a gender studies class unless you want to lose your head.
And that is so unbelievable to me, because it seems to me the whole point of academia is to be able to look through certain lenses and be able to look. If you're looking through the world at only one lens, you're going to see a very warped perspective of it. But, if you balance out, feminist theory with something like evolutionary psychology, you get a much broader picture. So why would you want to reject this knowledge? It's just so bizarre to me. You're not honest in your academia if you're deliberately, what's the word I use? Willful ignorance, right? Denying competing theories. That's willful ignorance, and that's academic dishonesty.
Well, that's what the Colette article mentioned. That she talked about how as the year went on, her first year in graduate school, the scope of thinking narrowed further and further, and more and more things are proscribed or verboten, and ideas are utterly off the table. The world starts to shrink. And she saw that her perspective was being forced into shrinking, and the only relief for her is realizing that there's a world outside of academia. Unfortunately, academia is reproducing those people that are outside of it as well, and so the ideologies that are being perpetrated or promulgated in academia are being spread throughout the whole social body. They're not just limited to it's not the idea that this is some phenomenon on an ivory tower is utterly belied by the fact that universities are ideological state apparatuses reproducing certain ideological constructs across the whole social body.
Yeah, when you import academic, I guess, ideas into the broader culture, it's like unleashing a monster, because a lot of people take things up that they really don't understand the background of and that kind of thing, right?
It becomes, like I said, a social justice cartoon.
Yeah. A caricature.
It's a factory. Really.
Yeah. You get Google is what you end up with. You put it into corporate America, you get Google. Which is a lunatic asylum,
Yeah, it used to be something about innovation. Now it's
about innovation, all right. There's people there that are innovating their identities into a wingless yellow dragonfly. That's what they identify as, and the side of an ornate building. That's their identity. Okay, that's the innovation that's going on there.
Well, the problem with university students that get indoctrinated with these ideas is that they graduate. That's the biggest problem, and they're released
and end up holding positions of power and influence.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I don't know about the gender studies students, but
well, yeah. I mean, again, like if you look into the rich academic history of certain fields, you can derive a lot of really good things from it. But if you just deploy it out there without any nuance, well, what do you expect?
No, right? Nuance is dead. I keep saying it.
What's dead?
Nuance is dead.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Yeah. Oh, we have a caller in the line, apparently.
Do we have a caller in the line?
Do we?
No, we don't.
I think so.
Oh, no, that's me.
Okay.
I never mind. I'll just get rid of that. No, we don't.
Okay.
We'd love to have a caller on the line.
Yeah. We've got...
comments, comments. Go for it.
Yeah, no, I've been watching, and Vincent is on Facebook, and we've got Brenda Fly and Todd Clemson on YouTube, but yeah, we don't have a big audience right now, I have to admit.
I don't know what they could possibly doing otherwise. I don't understand it.
Yeah.
Come on, guys, gotta watch this damn thing.
Call us.
That'll go out. Oh, see, now it's call
do I have to resort to shaming tools again? I'm
kidding.
We'll have to resort to Frankfurt School critical theoretical shaming.
We will delve into it until you call.
Yeah.
No, I'm actually really looking forward to the book, because I want to understand how it got to this point. I mean, when I was going to university in the 80s, there was none of this, like zilch, as far as I could tell.
Right.
When I was doing my undergrad in the 90s, there was some of that stuff, but it was taught in a way that, here's a lens through to, look at social phenomenon. Here's another one, right? Like, it wasn't indoctrination. It was about introducing theories, competing theories. Right. And that, I think, was very healthy,
Yes, and they drove those other theories out. In an effort to simplify things, because they want it to be interestingly, these are people that say there's no binary in gender, but these are the most binary thinkers on earth. Everything is black and white. There's no...
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just the way they think. Like I said, nuance is dead. And it's a shame, because all the interesting stuff is in the nuance, not in the black and white. Black and white is easy.
Yeah. Even in evolutionary psychology, for example, there's a huge, significant element of the cultural elements, which has been developed through this notion of memes as the real the real original meaning of memes as
units of cultural
Yeah. It's a cultural carrier, it's a gene in culture that carries cultural information, like a gene carries biological information.
Yeah, and it reproduces in brains and gets spread around, that kind of. Dawkins.
Well, now on social media. Social media is going to be the new overlord, because that's where all the memes are, right?
Yeah, but the word meme has taken on an entirely different.
Yeah.
Now they're trying to like make memes illegal in certain European countries. So like, wow, like seriously? It's like trying to make a classic advertisement.
Statement put on it turns into a graphical, a graphical version with a textual statement involved. I mean, it's not, and so that's all people think memes are. Memes are just.
Yeah, meme has a different meaning on Facebook than it does in academia. That's for sure. I mean, meme is just funny.
Yeah, but I think the academic term has just been deployed in a very different way, right?
It's a meme.
Yeah.
A meme.
Like it's a unit of cultural transmission, according to Dawkins. So that could mean anything from a work of literature or music or art or, I don't know, a scientific idea, right? Anything that embeds itself into one brain, essentially, and then gets passed on and taken up by others.
Mm-hmm. That's right, and it competes just like genes do for survivability based on its suitability in the environment, how well it's greeted by the environment, how well the environment, how well it survives within a given context, cultural context. So and it's change. It makes for very fast, rapid change in culture, and in fact, what is social justice but a set of memes that are circulating and happen to be going, at a cancerous rate, and like a cancer as well.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think the same argument could apply on their side as well. Like obviously I have my own biases.
That's true of all ideas, though, right?
Of course,
white supremacist ideas are they're just as mimetic as social justice ones.
Well, and here again, here's another lens through which to look at the world and view human phenomenon. Like, you can look at it as mimetic, you can look at it as, through the social justice warrior lens, or patriarchy, or, whatever, are you familiar with the work of Gad Saad?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
that's really fascinating work, Evolutionary psychology combined with marketing. Which is kind of my background,
Yeah, he studies marketing from an evolutionary standpoint. Yeah, it's very stuff.
Yeah, because marketing, well, it's an evolutionary algorithm from a computer science perspective, because it finds what works, right? That's what it does. It doesn't necessarily intend on exploiting that, but it does, because that is what gets the sales.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sex sells. I'm sorry, you can make all your arguments about, it's exploitive and that kind of thing, but bloody hell, when it comes down to, the green, it sells. Mm-hmm. It's just a fact of reality,
Exactly.
We talked about on his show, how literary Darwinism, or, a Darwinistic treatment of literature has been utterly banned.
I'm sure.
Yeah, really? You can't be a literary Darwinist and survive. I mean, if you have tenure, you can put out books, anything you want, but it's not going to get you anywhere coming through.
Well, and I'm just going to bring, now I'm reminded of Jordan Peterson and his kind of archetypes and the Jungian thing and that kind of thing, right? And that's quite a clash to our community, I would say. He and Gad Saad have actually, or was it, Sam Harrison for sure, but it seems to me that Jordan Peterson is, oh God, this is a terrible word, but vomiting up the same old arguments that creationists have been using for hundreds of years, if not, millennia, right?
He sees religion in terms of archetypes. And these
Jungian.
It's a Jungian interpretation of religiosity and belief and mythos, various mythos, and it's an understanding that there is value. I mean, he, instead of going that far, he posits value in these. There's a normative move that he makes. You can analytically say that, yeah, there are, what might be going on in religion in certain religions in particular is a kind of archetypal mythos that are being purveyed and then occupied by the parishioners, by the believers and so forth. But he goes another step and he posits value in those archetypes, which is fine. He can do that whatever he wants, but just so we know what he's doing.
Sure, and I don't think there's, that's necessarily an invalid thing. Like, you get your hero narratives, but like, why ascribe it all to Christianity, I guess, is my problem, right? Because some of these archetypes precede Christianity. I have to grant that I've not, fully engaged with his entire body of work, but
thinking of Horus, and
I've heard some very naive criticisms coming from him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to. He's part of my tribe.
Okay. Yeah. Well, kind of in a way he is too, ours.
Yeah.
Because we all, I would say Randy and I are defenders of free speech for sure.
Oh,
so in that sense, on that issue, I
don't know that I agree with him about hierarchy as in human societies as utterly natural, as he puts it, that it's encoded strictly by biology.
Oh no.
That to me is ridiculous, because everything in social life and human life is mediated through culture and so on and so forth. So you can't that's reductionistic. It's a biological reductionism.
Yeah, we are a social animal species, but the design of society isn't dependent on that. It is, other than the fact that we get together in groups. So
society would be
how we do that
only dependent on that, wouldn't it?
You could say that in humans, culture is an emergent property of our biology, but once you have an emergent property, it becomes a whole other qualitative type of reality. It changes. It doesn't strictly operate according to the rules of the substrate from which it emerged. It's now its own independent being, and so therefore you can't really reduce human behavior to biological substrates as such unproblematically. You can acknowledge that indeed, evolution has shaped our behavior, and it has to have over billions of years. But also there's cultural evolution that's going on at a more rapid rate, and actually it happens according to a Lamarckian principles, as it turns out.
And linguistic evolution as well.
I can agree with that, Linguistic evolution, like words change meaning over time. We just discussed meanings. Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's a cultural influence for sure.
In a way, so it's it's a disagreement. I agree with him on the principle of academic freedom and the opening up of the panoply of various types of thinking in the university, rather than the social justice restriction and asphyxiation that we are under now. That doesn't mean I agree with everything he says. I do agree he should be allowed to say it. That's the difference, right?
Actually, something I forgot to touch on. At New York University, they created an anonymous phone service where somebody can make a complaint anonymously about a professor.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's actually in over 230 universities nationwide. It's called the Bias Reporting Hotline.
Oh, my God.
They have instituted these in almost every university in the country. And these are hotlines where you can either call, email, or in some universities they have apps for the phone where you can just click on the app, open it up, and make your report and submit it right there.
What could go wrong?
No, exactly. What could go wrong? It's social justice surveillance.
It's a wet dream.
System, yeah. Panopticism, as Foucault would put it. We have panopticism operating in the university. It's kind of like everybody is turned into a sentinel, a surveillance, or a Stasi agent.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Which is a very much a Foucaultian concept, right? Power and
Yeah, it's changing from late J at that point to 1984. I mean, now you've got that's pure 1984. And it's the tail wagging.
They don't see it at all. They don't see it. They don't see it. And then these biases are, and so the bias infraction or microaggression is reported, and then it's arbitrated. This bias response team, the administrators who decide, who basically arbitrate these bias infractions, they operate utterly behind closed doors without any transparency, and nobody knows what their biases are, as if they're some bias-free people. They're not. Of course they're not. So, interestingly enough, they're positing themselves as utterly neutral, but they're not neutral. They're social justice inflected administrators who are judging everything from a social justice ideological perspective, and that's the implicit thing that they can't say, but it's true. They can't say it though.
How do you defend yourself?
Admits that the university's been taken over by social justice ideology.
If you guys aren't uncomfortable with this, can we talk about Lindsay Shepherd? Or do you wish to continue to?
I'm triggered.
At the end of the show, we want to get your promotional, promote you and your book and all that kind of stuff. But if you want to talk about, because Lindsay Shepherd had the, foresight to record a really painful conversation.
This is the grad student in Canada who
Wilfrid Laurier.
Well, and she showed a YouTube
Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson speaking.
Yep.
Was chastised and punished. Yeah. I mean, I think it's amazing.
That was a star chamber.
She had the foresight to record her encounter, which I looked back on mine, and I wish I had recorded what happened in mine. And then because they're using that lack of a recording to lie. In effect.
Yeah. It was quite the inquisition. I mean, Rambucana, who overseed the TAs, he was oversaw. Excuse me, Nazi. He was basically saying that she was treating the students as adults, having a discussion, what do you do with this? He was saying you should have been critical, meaning she should have condemned Peterson, which in the context, it's pretty clear. And he's saying that they are young adults, as if that makes a difference. I mean,
everybody's Hitler. Crazy. Let's forget it now. Everybody's Hitler now.
Yeah. Especially Christine. Jeez.
What's the guy's name who posited that?
Godwin.
Godwin's law. Yeah. Everybody's racist. Everybody's sexist.
Whoever refers to the Hitler comparison loses, and but they don't care about that.
No, it's the irony is lost on them. I mean, he actually did invoke Godwin's law, didn't he? He came out and it was crazy, crazy comparison.
Well, Peterson, I mean, he's just doing the same shit that if he bothered to look at videos of atheists that are challenging these points, he probably wouldn't say such a thing, but he doesn't know. So he's spewing out the same old shit as far, from my take anyway. He just doesn't realize that,
what are you talking about?
Well, I mean, there's so many arguments in favor of a deity or whatever, right? And they've been rebutted, if not outright refuted for decades, if not,
trying to make actual proofs of the existence of God. Yeah, good luck.
And he's like, atheists don't really exist, and I'm like, oh god.
Oh, that's just condescending.
Yeah, we do. Think about, I'm a lifer, raised by an agnostic and an atheist, right? And they think they're atheists, and no, I don't think I'm an atheist. I've just never had that indoctrination in me in the first place. And think about kids from some of the more secular countries where non-belief is 60-70%. Those kids aren't, they don't think they're atheists. They're just simply brought up with reality.
Yeah, that's the norm.
I think he's wrong. I don't think that you can have knowledge one way or the other with reference to, this is what Karl Popper suggested in his Logic of Scientific Discovery, 1958 or 59, that there was a demarcation principle, and the metaphysical cannot be adjudicated by scientific means.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Well, true, but there are some gods that are logically impossible. So, they're, the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent God. That's a logical contradiction. You can't have that. So there are some, but...
But the deist perspective, though, it's hard to argue the deist perspective because their claim is essentially there's a prime mover who started things off and is now hands off and amoral and just isn't interested in who you're sleeping with or what you're eating or whatever, right?
Yeah, the problem with that the deist position is they can't account for the problem of evil.
Well, again, this is a argument that's been millennia. I don't know how old the argument is, but it seems millennia, right?
That's several hundred years. Deism it's only about 300 years, 300 or 400 years old. But it's. But
if you take it into other languages, like you can go back to the Spartans, they were non-believers. You can go back to, Aristotle. Didn't seem to me like he was much of a believer, so it's not that new.
Well, certainly Socrates was a believer.
Well, Socrates was accused of atheism.
Oh yeah, well it was because of his definition of God. It was not. He didn't believe in the pantheon of gods that was prevalent at the time.
Yeah.
The term atheism has changed. That's another word that's evolved, right? One time it meant non-Christian. Now it just means somebody who doesn't believe in God, which makes more sense actually. But that's just me.
I just believe in the demarcation principle. I don't think that you can really posit knowledge about that because knowledge is not. It doesn't lend itself. It can't be adjudicated.
Yeah, it's not testable.
In that register. So you can be an agnostic who believes, for example. You don't know, but you believe.
Right. Yeah.
Or you can
kind of, but I think most of us would say if you have doubts, you're probably not really a believer.
You could be an agnostic who doesn't believe too.
Yeah. I think that's what most atheists are.
Mm-hmm.
Agnostic atheists. If we were presented with evidence that were to change our minds, we would jump on board. Doesn't necessarily mean that we'd worship that God, but.
So don't some atheists claim to have knowledge that God doesn't exist? I mean, they.
Yeah, that would be an anti-theist. I think that we do have knowledge of certain gods not existing, but.
Like the God of the Christian Bible or whatever, I think that's
he's out.
Like Michael Shermer has done a pretty, good job of debunking that. But I think the claim with atheism is we don't believe in a God, and the claim with agnosticism is we don't know, right?
Well,
and until we're, again, I refer back to my childhood and my mom telling me, show me and I'll believe, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like I think most atheists are agnostic, but there are some in that quadrant of, they know that they know God doesn't exist. Yeah. Which is,
group. I can't abide that because I just think it's hubristic, but it's worse than that. It's making a claim that you'd have to be God to be able to know.
But in what sense is it hubristic? That's an interesting way to put it because we're just claiming we don't know, whereas
he's talking about anti-theists.
Yeah, I'm talking about.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm talking about the Gnostic.
Gnostic atheists.
Yeah.
That they say, those who say they definitively know there is no God, and I would say, my argument to that is that you'd have to be God to know that. Because you'd have to have a certain omniscience in the sense that you'd have to know everything that can be known, and that would be one of them. So, And that's because I don't think I think it's a metaphysical. It's not. We're not. I don't think the spaghetti monster analogy or argument works, because that's not what's being posited. Something like a material being in the sky. It's a non-material entity that can't be quantified, and so it doesn't follow those rules. So it is a metaphysical claim, and as such, it can't be educated in terms of empirical science.
Well, except
okay, but
if it interacts
the flying
with the
spaghetti
universe,
monster was invoked for a particular reason, to challenge creationism in schools and that kind of thing. So it was more a political statement, right? Nobody actually believes that there's a flying spaghetti monster, even though Randy and I are ordained into the church as ministers, right?
But I just mean those who posit that others believe that are mistaken, because that's not exactly their. I mean, unless they're mistaken, that doesn't really characterize Christianity, Christian believers, or even Muslim believers, or any kind of believers. I mean, nobody's positing there's a man in the or some monster in the sky or some physical.
But they do. Their holy texts do posit empirical claims, and many of them have been essentially disproven. Like, I get where you're coming from with philosophical assertions, but like when no, I don't think Allah rode up to the sky in a freaking unicorn and white horse, or whatever.
I can't remember.
No, come on.
You could say that. I mean, I don't think any Christians don't really buy that, and they're not talking about that in any sort of literal way. I think that's a metaphorical construction. It's understood that way.
I think some people do take texts very literally, especially having interacted with many ex-Muslims and that kind of thing,
nuts, of course.
who are very critical about their, I guess, religious background, but have abandoned that.
I'm not defending religion. I'm not trying to defend religion as such. My idea is just to be. Basically, I believe in a sort of big tent secularism, in the sense of I don't want to exclude people who want to be involved in those. Right. And the kind
Fair enough. And I'm sorry if I put you in an uncomfortable position.
No, I'm not uncomfortable. I don't care.
No, it brings up a broader point that there are the spectrum of belief within Christianity is huge, and as well it is in Islam, and there are some that are really literal about both the Bible and the Quran, and really do believe that Muhammad rode up on a winged horse. It's very broad, and I think Penn Teller, I think he's got a point when he says there is no such thing as Christianity as a single entity. It's a very broad range of beliefs.
That's right.
Yeah. You've got Catholic nuns in the U.S. that are championing women's reproductive rights, that are pro-choice, and that kind of thing, right? So
Catholics
for Choice, isn't that what the group is called?
Evangelical Christians who are, or evangelical Christians who would, who are certainly different from the, I guess they're some sort of Episcopalian women ministers who are effectively like social justice warriors, if you will. They certainly, these two camps really have almost nothing in common besides a common vocabulary that they don't even agree on the meaning of the term. So it's almost like a wholly different culture. It's almost a different way.
Yeah, they don't even understand each other, is what you're saying, right? Yeah.
I mean, they don't understand women ministers with tattoos talking about the immigrants. They don't care about that, and they think that has nothing to do with Christianity in their minds. Nothing.
Yeah.
It's just the range of ideas within that umbrella of Christianity is just huge. I mean, you can't assume anything about any one of them.
But it's a healthy debate that's going on within their own community. Yeah.
I think so. It's interesting that the real scary fundamentalists to me now are not the religious right any longer. But they're not in ascendancy at all. It's the social justice left. That's the real religious fundamentalist in my mind.
I completely concur with that. Yeah, they frighten me because they just reminded of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I have to make the distinction between SJWs who are interested in things like man-spreading and blah, blah, blah kind of thing. What the hell? Go away. Versus social justice warriors, the regressive left, right, who are actually defending very sinister practices outside of their own country because they're just simply not aware of what's outside their own borders,
Well, the contradictions of leftism are incredible, like the fact that you have Western feminists embracing, Linda Sarsour.
Oh my God! Don't get me started.
Don't get me started on Linda Sarsour. We can be here all night.
Said the wrong thing. Linda Sarsour, everything blows up.
I just do not get it. I've had. Never mind.
Exactly, you're exactly right. That's just a prime example of exactly what I'm talking about.
I'm trying to figure out that whole thing is why do they embrace something that is anathema to their own ideological belief, ideology? And I think it is weird. It's got to be two things. One, I think one of them is cultural relativism.
Yeah.
I hate that.
And the other one is the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
I'll go one further on you, and I will say that the word Islamophobia has been deployed into popular culture.
It was designed
deliberately, as opposed to anti-Muslim bigotry, which I totally agree exists, and I will defend, right? Anybody who's, being
shouldn't discriminate
against, right?
On the basis of anything. There shouldn't be discriminated against.
But I think we have a right to fear Islam as a political movement.
That's right.
You don't hear Christianophobia or Hindu, phobia. These just aren't words that exist in our vocabulary.
That's because it's allowed. To be real frank, it is allowed. Whereas, well,
it's been deployed deliberately into the, I guess the social realm to.
That's right.
Look at that. You
as a tool of, I don't want to sound like I'm paranoid or anything, but again, I've talked to a lot of ex-Muslims, and they see through this shit. It's a rhetorical, it's a dishonest rhetorical tactic to, call out people racist because you disagree with the tenets of a religion, which has nothing to do with race.
On that note, I want to say that I critique in my book transgender ideology, which I say is no more makes me a transphobe than I would be a hater of individual Scientologists if I critique Scientology. So I'm saying it's legitimate to critique a particular ideology and a political idea and a theoretical or a philosophical idea. You can't say that therefore makes you a hater of those people who embrace that. That's completely non sequitur, But they don't.
Well, it's a red herring. It's a total red herring. Right? They try to equate the two or conflate the two, and it is not. It's just not true.
Not only is it not true, but it actually harms people that, like Majid Nawaz says, the minority within the minority, right? It harms people. And he won that lawsuit with the
SPLC.
Good. Because, they were putting him at danger.
Well, they didn't win it. They settled. But, there's also a bunch of other people on that list of deplorables that SPLC came up with that are going to sue as well. So
it makes their prison that much harder to get out of. And that's not to say that, that's not to suggest any sort of messianic complex where I'm looking to liberate people from pernicious ideologies. Although if it happens, that's great. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, to say that critiquing that ideology is off limits, that makes those people who want to get out or try to find a way to criticize it have no tools to do it.
Well, they're shut down right away.
Well, and in my case, I don't want to, because I'm not. There are some groups that can defend themselves because they enjoy freedom of speech. But when I speak out on behalf of atheists and Muslim societies, people, message me. They don't dare speak, publicly. But I'm sorry I can't friend you. But thank you so much for sharing these ideas. So I'm pretty comfortable with critiquing that, whereas some of the North American things I'm not so comfortable critiquing, because I'm sorry, I think manspreading is bullshit and is stupid. I'm just not going to waste my time on that shit.
Right.
But if I say that, which I have now, obviously, I'm going to get hate on me, right?
What about mansplaining?
Yeah, but I'm woman-splaining to you exactly what I'm talking about here, right? You know, just like, there's toxic masculinity and there's toxic femininity too, right? You know, it's not this one-sided thing.
They're coming for you.
Pardon me?
You just push the button.
You know what? I've decided I don't get enough hate in my life. Like, everybody seems to like me, and I just want to be controversial. It's, you know, if you're not pissing off people, you're not doing your job, right?
Damn straight.
Social justice, red guard, and make them legally able to, you know, imprison us. We're all going down to the gulag anyway. So.
Yeah,
no kidding. Our Gulag Archipelago all over again. So anyway, we've gone like an hour and 3/4. We've been chatting, and so you've got your book coming out on August 1st.
Yeah.
The springtime for Snowflakes.
Book of the year.
No, that was a joke.
I didn't know that.
I was talking the Time magazine cover in which they suggested that, you know, Trump had imprisoned this little girl without her. Totally turned out to be a fabrication. So I figured if Time could do anything like that and make up anything and put it on their cover, so come on. And
so you mean a meme?
That was a meme. I felt bad that anybody believed it, because I wish it were true, but it isn't. Yeah, it's going to be true.
No, I look forward to this, because I think it is I've actually been looking for books on exactly this topic, and there just doesn't seem to be anything out there, and I'm looking forward to hearing or reading your hypotheses on this, and it should be a very interesting talk.
It's done in a memoir form. Yes. I actually write it as I go through a narrative of my graduate education in all this. So I was an insider. I'm an apostate. So that's where.
Well, yeah, it's you get labeled with all the standard. That's one thing I notice about social justice, is that if you violate dogma, if you go running, you speak against dogma, that it is the greatest possible punishment. That
for the Legion of Regressive
shouldn't have been going. I'll let that. I hit the wrong key. Yeah, the Catholic Watch. No, we're not doing Catholic Watch today. It's meted out. The greatest possible punishment is what's meted out immediately. It's not, even if it's perceived, it's not even necessarily having to be a real slight, and it's something that, you know, that it drives me nuts.
All you have to do is make a slight linguistic slip, and you're cooked. I mean, and they have very strict linguistic, you know, rules and phraseology that you have to abide by, or else you're out. You know.
Yeah, well, literally you're out, because what happened at Ryerson University, I don't know if you heard about this, the department head was at a seminar, was being given by a woman of color, and had left the room.
I saw that, yeah.
You saw that? Yeah. And nobody bothered to ask this department head why he left the room. It was just assumed to be the worst case scenario, the most egregious case. And he eventually had to resign. It's crazy.
He left the room while a sacred victim identity person was speaking
on the top of the pyramid.
Yeah, this is like, you know, it's like walking out of a lecture that God was giving, you know.
yeah, exactly. And
you know, as you're talking about somebody whose status as in the social justice realm is inviolable, and it's sacred. It's attained to sacred status.
Yeah, and it just amazes me that something that could be, it's just a perceived slight, it's not even real, becomes something that somebody has to resign over. It just makes no sense. It's a tail wagging the dog.
I would not have resigned. I would force them to push me to the wall off the edge, and then I would, there's no way. Never apologize, never quit, never resign, never, never say you're sorry.
Administrations cave into this. That's the thing. There's no support for their staff.
And don't let them put you in any kind of, remediation or, re-education camps, effectively. Don't go for it. Yeah.
Like the what was that one that it was on toxic? It was a course for new students on toxic masculinity, and I'm like, no, you believe me, I'm not going to go. That's the first step in indoctrination.
And I don't know if you've heard about the tunnels of oppression that happen in orientations in universities in the U.S. In the Midwest, they make white students go through a tunnel, and while they're going through this tunnel, minority students hurl epithets and abusive language on them so that they understand what it's like to suffer racism. This is part of the orientation program.
I had not heard of that.
God.
That is fascinating. And wow.
It's just
sad.
Unbelievable. There was no way I would accede to such a thing.
No,
if I found my daughter was going, I have a 21-year-old daughter, and if I found she was going, Randy, she actually got the hard copy of that consensual. Oh my God, it's so condescending. There's like a coloring book up here that they're giving away to. Yeah. Oh, you've got one too. Yeah.
The consent coloring book.
It's so offensive in terms of like that. They're giving this out to post-secondary students, and it's just so mind-numbingly insulting in terms of their maturity level.
Yeah, and yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's infantilization.
At NYU, I had to go through this. I did do it because if you didn't do it, you couldn't go back.
Yeah.
I didn't have to go in any room or get any lectures at me, but they made us go through this quiz. And one of the questions, it was a sexual harassment thing. One of the questions is if a student tells you that they were sexually assaulted by somebody while they were in 5th grade, do you have to tell the university Title IX, that's what they call it, the Title IX officer? And I said, no. I mean, what do I have to do with what would the university be arbitrating or dealing with past history, like ancient history in terms of students?
It's a matter for police.
Yeah.
And the answer was yes, you have to tell them. You have to tell them.
Come on. Why? What can they do about it?
I don't know.
Well, you know what? I would ask the student whether they wanted me to deal with that, like report it, and here's the procedures I can help you with. But I would totally encourage them to go to the police.
This is obligatory to tell the university, and it's like the university has become this overlord. This, it is incredible what they arrogate to themselves as their domain, as under their purview. It's incredible. And relationships with between employees of the university and people who have nothing to do with the university are now being being regulated and observed and monitored and treated under the rubric of university business. They are, if you can't have a falling out with someone. Anything you do with anybody anywhere, whether it has anything to do with university policy or not, if you have a relationship gone sour and anything, it can't. It's university business.
Yeah,
that's crazy. Yeah. That's all resulting from the Dear Colleague letter from the Obama administration.
That's right.
Title IX, and it was never intended for this purpose.
Mm-mm.
It's a bunch of kangaroo courts. I mean, if somebody is sexually assaulted, they should be going to the police.
Go to the police. The university has no business investigating, policing it, arbitrating anything, penalizing. It's not their purview. It's a police matter. If you're raped, that's a crime.
Yeah.
Police. You don't talk to some administrator about that. What authority should they have over that? They should have none. Go to the police.
Or tweeting it, right?
Yeah.
Like, come on. Go to the police. And you know what the police would say? Don't talk about this.
That's right. They would say, don't tweet about it. Don't meet.
Because we need to investigate.
Yep.
Right.
Shut up.
Don't collude.
Don't jump on the Me Too bandwagon to get virtue points. By virtue of your victimization. Just report the crime.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh wow, we're gonna get nailed for this.
Oh, we are. Like I said, I just don't get enough hate in my life. Like I try to cause controversy, and everybody thinks I'm so sweet.
You're so
I can't help it.
You and me both. I can't either. It's just silliness run amok. I don't know, like.
But you know me, I'm a diplomat, obviously, right?
Yeah, you are.
And I'll even argue on the, devil's advocate side of things too. Try to negotiate peace, essentially, right? So people perceive me as being,
Like I say in my book, I don't think, that it should be, for example, that social justice, peace, belief, or believers should be driven out of the university. What I say in the book is that they should be taken down from the parapet of running the university and treated like their belief should be treated like any other belief.
Stop the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, the social sciences ought to do, I get that there's different methodologies and that kind of thing in social sciences, but they ought to, I guess from a, what do I want to call it, demarcation perspective, try to be as empirically robust as they can.
That's right, and don't be based on certain things as verboten to talk about or taboo, or based on dicta that are being handed down by social justice warrior.
And I don't even think so much it's not talked about. It's just that people put on blinders and refuse to listen to criticisms of their own theory. Right?
Well, they don't allow it. They don't allow this.
Yeah.
If you go into a gender studies classroom, you can't invoke evolutionary biology unless you're doing it in a derisory way in order to make a joke of it or condemn it. You cannot entertain it seriously, or you're going to be run out.
Or you're committing violence by doing that.
That's
language is violence and all this crap.
I just hate that. I'm going to really, really be violent then.
I have to say that I just find, when there's been I'll invoke my German guilt again kind of thing, but the Holocaust, we ought to take serious lessons from that. And when we start enacting language that trivializes those experiences, I get really mad.
Yeah, making comparisons.
This and that is like a concentration camp, or this. Everybody.
Or you're a Nazi,
I was called Nazi, and I'm a classical liberal.
Yeah.
I mean, my whole thing is anti-authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And yet, to call me a Nazi is so far off. They're just so far off. They're so politically illiterate. It's incredible. And it also, as you said, it trivializes the real horrors that people suffered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I have to interject here because I have a comment from Sam, and he asks, how did you get permission to publish this book?
Permission from who?
That's
I don't need permission to publish it. That's the thing. That's my argument, is that I'm allowed to say what I want to, provided I don't violate, in the United States, free speech has a very broad parameters. We're allowed to say things, even if it's hate speech. There's no such category in our country under law. But you're not allowed to say, kill those bastards right there. And, that is inciting violence. You can't do that.
Well, that's kind of what we would regard as hate speech here in Canada.
Would it?
You can't incite violence. You can't, yell fire in the theater or whatever kind of thing, right?
Right.
So
that's part of it, but
I guess we've, our blasphemy laws have been taken off our books. Thank goodness. Thank you, Trudeau.
We don't. Right? Yeah, we don't have. Yeah, well, freedom of belief is.
That's part of the UN.
For expression there.
Human rights.
Criticizing Islam in England is now illegal.
Yes.
So that is
burning the Quran.
That's reinstituting of a blasphemy law.
Yes.
Yeah.
They don't have. Well, they don't have free speech. They don't have a constitution, but it's all common law, but they don't have free speech in England.
No.
Technically, same with Germany. Germany's doing the same thing.
And the religion they're blaspheming in is not Islam. It's social justice. That's the religion whose tenets they're violating. That's the religion that's dominating the state.
Yeah. Well, you see it in the tweets from the police. Making derogatory comments is illegal, and of course, the first thing people do is tweet derogatory comments to the police. Like, really, you didn't see that coming, did you?
You're allowed to do that. I mean, that's really. But if you criticize Islamic grooming gangs like Tommy Robinson,
you can't talk about that. You can't talk about that. Even though Majid Nawaz. Got it backwards. Najid Nawaz. Do I have it backwards again? Majid Nawaz. There we go. Yeah.
No, you're fine.
He's talked about the grooming gangs on the BBC, but I guess he's allowed because he's Muslim. I mean, it's kind of a contradiction.
So it's a protected category, yeah.
Yeah, it's a special case, and but if you're not Muslim, well, you can't talk about that, which is ridiculous.
I don't like the term grooming gang. It's such a euphemism. These are rape gangs.
Yeah, they're rape gangs.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what we call them? What they are? They're rape training.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
It's like I thought grooming gangs that are, in hindsight, when you say that, I'm like, yeah, you're right, because grooming gang sounds sinister enough, but when you put it in those words, you're just expressing reality in a more profound way.
Yeah, grooming gangs, it's like we're combing their hair,
or eating insects out of their hair.
Giving them bikini waxes and pedicures and manicures,
training them in prostitution, in forced prostitution. That's what's
Yeah. I like to think most people are familiar with, grooming, that the difference in language, but it's a like gentle euphemism, I suppose, right? That
I think it is
called out in much more clear language.
Yeah.
That's
interesting. The question of who gave me permission. I wonder what the questioner is thinking in terms of maybe my lawyers. My lawyers,
maybe.
They're not that happy with this, but.
Well, the person who's asking is an ex-Muslim from Hungary.
That's a good question.
I think he's from Hungary. Yeah.
So far, we're allowed to say stuff like this. It could come to an end soon, though.
Yeah, and also my friend is very outspoken, even though we post anonymously, basically. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not so anonymous.
No, I've been pretty.
I question dogma. It's anyway,
we use their real names even.
Right. Yeah. The 2-hour mark. I think we should stop it here. And so your book's coming out August 1st.
Right. Springtime for Snowflakes.
Yeah. And your Twitter. You can follow Michael on Twitter. His handle is @AntiPCNYUProf. And thanks for being on. The show has been a great discussion.
It's been
fantastic. I'd love to have you on again at some point to do some regular stories that we typically do.
That'd be great. I love that.
Yeah. Great to have a different perspective. We're always looking for different perspectives. Because we start becoming an echo chamber. I want to kind of avoid that.
I try to avoid that too.
Yeah. So, great.
Thank you so much. Nice talking to you.
Well, thank you to you, but I just want to ask, is there anything else you'd like to promote or share with our 3-people audience?
That's not I think that's enough. Just the book and my Twitter handle. And that's it. Yeah, and once you get into my Twitter account, you'll see what other things I'm promoting and certain ideas that I'm actually promoting and things like that. That'll do it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Have a good one. Thank you again.
Good.
Are we doing our outro?
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
That was good.
It was good. Yeah.
Okay. Quiet.
Okay.
You've been listening to the Legion of Reason diversion coming to you